Alright, so it's time for another one of those worst to best videos that I love doing so much. This is where I take a look at one band or artist in particular and rate all of their albums from worst to best. Now, as with all of these, this is my own personal opinion, so I'm not saying the first one I'm going to be talking about is the absolute worst album that the band has put out. I'm not saying that the first one is the absolute best and pinnacle of everything that they've done. All I'm saying is that if I had all their albums laid out in front of me, which one would I grab first and which one would I grab last? And also, I'm not looking at any live material. I'm not looking at any compilations. I'm not looking at like any demos or EPs. This is only going to be studio releases from this particular band. So let's talk about Storm Corrosion. This was the supergroup pairing of the millennia. Both artists were at the crust of changing career paths slightly. We have Michael Eckefelt from Opeth, the lead singer, songwriter, frontman of the band, and Steven Wilson, fresh off the tails of kind of leaving Porcupine Tree and putting a hiatus to the band and really starting to look at his own solo project. And both were like really starting to shift focus. Michael had kind of put a stop to all the growls as well. The music was a lot less brutal, a lot less metal, and a lot more progressive, a lot more rockish, a lot more of that 70s acid rock styles. And as I said, Steven Wilson had put a hiatus to Porcupine Tree. The last album of The Incident was a number of years behind. He had just, I believe, released Grace for Drowning. A lot of people didn't quite know what to expect because both of these artists up to that point, they had come with a back catalog of very heavy music. The last few albums from Porcupine Tree were practically metal, and Opeth was a straight-up death metal band. That really had an interesting context for where Storm Corrosion was going to go. Now, this wasn't necessarily the first collaboration that the boys have had of Steven and Michael. Both had worked pretty intimately in the past. Steven had produced a lot of Opeth albums at that time. Michael has been a very big fan of Porcupine Tree and Steven for a while, so this was an inevitable kind of cross-pollination of a project. So let's talk about the entire discography of Storm Corrosion with ranking all their albums from worst to best. So let's dive into that. Number 1, Storm Corrosion by Storm Corrosion, released in 2012. Yep, this is arguably, and I don't think anybody's going to dispute this, the best album that the band has ever done. Released in 2012, Storm Corrosion, the self-titled work, was definitely, in some respects, not what the main populace was expecting. The best word to use for this album is atmospheric. It is a very atmospheric and impressionistic album. This is a very stripped down album, and it's very intimate as well. You can see that some of the main influencers on this are like Scott Walker, very dark atmospheres on this. All these songs are very set in minor chords. There's not a whole lot of like really big moments. A lot of it is just intimate, small moments. A lot of it is also just two masters of the guitar work really playing with different rhythm sections that they could find within the guitar work. I mean, the only track that actually has drum work on it is Hag, and it's very like over processed as well. Like you can definitely hear that the drum work has been put through some kind of a sound processing program to make it sound almost like a second thought. And it's the only moment where like everybody kind of takes a look at the drum work and be like, wait, what is this? What's going on here? Because the songs that precede it, Drag Ropes and Storm Corrosion, don't have any drum work outside of maybe a like a cymbal or a tom hat or just something that's adding just a little bit of a rhythm section. All the rhythm is found within the guitar work itself. And it shouldn't come as a shock that the drum work was provided by Gavin Harrison, lead drummer for Porcupine Tree at the time, and it definitely has that powerhouse MO that we come to expect with Gavin. But yeah, let's talk about some of the nitty-gritties of this. Let's normally within these worst to bests, I really just kind of give a broad brush stroke of a review, but I think we can get a little bit deeper within this one, I think. So yeah, Drag Ropes opening this track up, and this was the song that the band dropped ahead of time, and I almost wish that they didn't. I wish that they didn't release any promotional material and just like let the world discover the album as a whole, because I think it lessened some of the impact that this album could have had if they hadn't released any kind of promotional material. The guitar works and the dual guitar works as well, where both weren't necessarily that big bombastic power chord chugging guitars. It was all that very quick picking kind of a guitar work. The two players are masters of this. Like, both Steven and Michael are really great at doing all these. And Drag Ropes, just where the song ebbs and flows, where it slowly builds and there's a lot of tension coming up within this. And like, it reminds me of kind of like Sweeney Todd, especially with those first couple of lines of "Now then, my friend." I almost want to continue with "Now to your purpose," but that kind of same building of tension. You can definitely feel like there's something waiting in the wings within this song. There's something creeping in that dark forest as we're kind of navigating through. Vocalizations are also a very big part about this album, how Michael and Steven harmonize with one another and how that is built. It is just so great, because that's really what provides such atmosphere within it. Not only just that intimacy within Michael saying "Now then, my friend," but also once we come into that "Now, brah," like the voice is its own instrument. When we're using some mellotrons, when we're using some strings, when we're using like those types of music on this, it just brings forth a new dimension of music, and you can definitely feel like the overabundant use of mellotrons on this. I love it. And then we come into Storm Corrosion. This might be one of my favorite tracks off of this album. Very Scott Walker-ish, very atmospheric, and it blends a lot of really interesting things. Like, we have so much chaos within this, with only like being a smattering of sounds coming here and there. What I love is this tightening of a coil, and you don't really feel any kind of a release. It just stops tightening and then it just disappears. Like, there's no release, it's just a disappear. And I love how like all the different strings and all the different sounds are really floating in, and it's very choppy. And then we just get that guitar work with Steven at the end, just kind of finishing off the track before we come into Hag. And again, I already mentioned with Hag being that very prominent drum work near the mid sequence of the song there. But yeah, I think with Hag, it's just, I don't know. Like, I like the track, but at this point, after a couple of tracks already, I'm starting to get the feel of it, and I'm starting to get the hang of things here. And then we come into Happy, which I think is such a great little track. It's the shortest, almost at 5 minutes, and it is kind of the most optimistic track out of the entire album, which is saying something if you actually hear this, because it isn't all that happy. I think because this is set in more of a major chord than the other tracks, and I like that concept of this being near the end. We're coming into the latter half, just being a little bit of a breather of fresh air. Lock Howl, I love just with a little bit more of a prominent fixture on this track, because I love the build. I love the build of this track. I love that dun 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 dun. I like how that's the meat of this track. Like, this is probably my favorite track in terms of the structure, and I love how it just continuously builds just with that really strong foundation. And as it starts to build, you start to hear this really strange orchestration of sound. And once we come into like the halfway point where those mellotrons come in and you have that clapping, that dun 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 dun, I think because it's so much more tangible than a lot of the other tracks that we found on this album, I love how I can actually like grab hold of this and like really look at it. And even after the big like mellotron coming in with a lot of that, I like how it still decides to, wait, we still have a lot more ground to cover here. The last track of Lugent Inan, I think that's how you pronounce this one. This is the longest track at 10 minutes and 20 seconds. This one I could probably take or leave, but I do like the fact that this is the track that ends off the album. It's much more airy, it's a lot lighter than a lot of the other tracks that we found on this album, and it provides a really great kind of come down after the craziness that has come before this. And it also shows Michael's singing style as well, where he's much more of a falsetto singer on this track, something that we haven't really heard from him before. So in one sense, this is definitely him stretching his legs and seeing what he can do vocally. And it does have that guitar work, that really nice, that's a really strange way to say that this is a nice way to end the album off. It isn't necessarily the morning, but it is seeing the sun starting to creep up over the horizon after the intense night that this album has. So Yeah, that's why it's number 1 on my list for Storm Corrosion's worst to best. If I were to rate this, if this was an actual album review, I would definitely say this is one that you want to pick up in physical format easily. You know, it definitely isn't a perfect album. This is much more of an experiment. This was much more of a shock and awe kind of an album. This one is one that subsedes the expectations of what people wanted. And I don't think we're going to get another one just because of what Storm Corrosion wanted to do. I think that if Michael and Steven were to do another project, they wouldn't do another Storm Corrosion project. They would do something else because they're kind of like that. So yeah, that's about it. What did you guys think of my ranking? What would you put as Storm Corrosion's best album? What would you put as Storm Corrosion's worst album? Let me know of those by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.